Okay, so hi everyone. Today I have David Friedman with me. He's an amazing libertarian economist, philosopher, and of course, physicist, right?
Well, I'm not really a physicist. I have a doctorate in physics, but I haven't practiced physics for something like 50 years now, so I can't really claim to be a physicist.
Okay, yeah,
I
okay,
did I
cool.
did a few years of postdoctoral work and then switched fields because I found economics was more fun and I thought I was better at it.
Okay, cool. So I suppose my first question, I think that is related to libertarianism. And so you talked a few months ago with uh, Matt. I think his name was Deity Defeater at that time. Uh, you talked to him. He's a utilitarian, and I'm not.
Mhm.
Uh, I generally I'm leaning toward some sort of natural rights kind of view, by
My
nausea or
my
anyone.
view of where I get moral knowledge is what's referred to as intuitionism. That is
Yeah.
to say, I observe a situation, I have certain feelings about it, and I believe that those feelings are to some degree an observation of moral reality. I'm a moral realist in that sense. When I try to do that, I conclude that neither a strict natural rights nor a strict consequentialist view correctly describes my moral intuitions. That is to say, if I try to describe the natural rights that I sympathize with, I can think of situations where I would not act the way that rule says to. And the same thing is true for consequentialist arguments. So the best I can come up with is that violating people's rights is a bad thing, but there are other bad things in the world, and therefore there are circumstances in which it's correct to violate a right because you are preventing something else that's much worse. And I've discussed that at least in one of my books, a number of times.
Yeah. So I think Michael Humer is also an intuitionist.
Correct. Yes, Michael
Uh,
Humer has a book on intuitionism, and I read it in the hopes that he could answer what I think is the best argument against our position. And
yeah.
he thinks he does, and I think he doesn't. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
So I would say like I am an intuitionist too. Like I like to call myself some kind of like value pluralist or moral pluralist. And the
yes,
approach I take is generally some sort of natural rights approach,
yes,
where I think of natural rights as an approach, not as like a whole monistic theory,
yes,
which,
right,
explains all our intuitions or something
yeah,
like that. It's
right,
more as an approach that can, help people.
yes,
Now, I think, do you know Mark Friedman? Uh,
no,
Okay, so he's also a libertarian philosopher. Like he actually cited your example to like some kind of absolute view of natural rights, where he talks about like your case about asteroid on Earth,
yes,
and
mhm,
someone is like a misanthrope and he's not giving the equipment, even though that
yes.
equipment would be helpful to, save lives,
To
even
divert
himself.
the asteroid that would otherwise kill us all. That's
Yeah.
my hypothetical. Yeah.
Yeah, so he takes two approaches to solve it. One is moral pluralism, and another is he talks about Lockean Proviso, where he says that uh, there are constraints based on the proviso such that uh, the people are allowed to infringe the rights of the property owner,
Mhm.
but they are but so in so the within like rights based view, even absolute rights based view, if someone wants to think of it that way, uh, perhaps there are ways like, Lockean Proviso, and even in them there is like distinction between violation and infringement, right? That's like specificationism, where infringement can be done in some cases, but violation would be something that's just not permissible at all.
And what is the
So
difference?
So the infringement would be that. So, for example, with Lockheed Proviso, he, I think Mark Friedman
As
says
the problem with the Lockheed Proviso, as I assume you know, is if you take it seriously, you can never have ownership of land at all. Because the last claimant can't claim, because now, since he's claimed, the next person can't claim. But since the last claimant can't claim, the next to last claimant can't claim, because his claiming will prevent the last claimant from claiming. So it unravels. It's just like standard, if you're familiar with the standard argument about why prisoner's dilemma results in betraying on every time. It's exactly the same argument. That the last step, it's an induction argument, and the last step prevents all of the previous steps. But anyway, that's not the point you're making. I'm just explaining why the Lockheed Proviso has problems.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with that. But like, I'm very amateur, very beginner here. Yeah. I'm not a philosophy student. Yeah. So yeah, perhaps that's a kind of problem. This is why I kind of think that perhaps moral pluralism would be better. You know, intuitionism would be
I don't see at least how the Lockheed Proviso is going to save you. It would save you if what you needed was his land. But what if what you need is the product of his mind, which he completely owns, product of his body. So I actually have a chapter in third edition of Machinery where I offer a solution to the problem of private property and land, but it's not a very good solution. And it has it implies a different set of provisos.
Okay, so yeah, I think in his book, he gives like two approaches, and one of the approaches moral pluralism, one is Lockheed Proviso. And I mean, since you have said like perhaps there are more problems with Lockheed Proviso, then as I said, I think moral pluralism.
What is his other solution?
As I said, right, Lockheed Proviso and moral pluralism, right? In Lockheed Proviso, he says like there could be constraints that are made within the system.
Pluralism, it would essentially be my answer, would be that violating his right is a bad thing, but having everybody on earth die is a much worse thing, and therefore I'm willing to do the one to avoid the other.
Yeah. And I think so one of the things with like now I'm more into philosophy of religion. So I'm generally looking at, you know, what kind of ethical system people are advocating for, what kind of political system advocating for, you know, for. So some of the traditionalists who believe that Islam is true, some of the traditionalists believe that rights of, you know, people who are suppose gay, or, you know, people who have committed fornication, they deserve very harsh punishment for their lifestyles or actions. And now, of course, I think libertarians.
But I think they're correctly describing Islamic law. That I'm not sure what the sources are on fornication. Sorry, on homosexuality. But it is clear, I think, in Islamic law that having sexual intercourse is with somebody you're not married to or is not your legal concubine is a crime. And if you have had the opportunity to have legal intercourse, it's a capital crime. If you haven't had the opportunity to have legal intercourse, you're supposed to get a certain number of, get beaten, essentially. It's a certain flogging offense. But that's one of the very small list of Quranic offenses. And, you know, if that's what God says and you believe in God and that particular version of God, then I guess you reach that conclusion.
Yeah, that's what they reach, right? Now, of course, there are some libertarian Muslims, you know, like Mustafa Akyol. Do you know him? Have you heard about him?
No.
Okay. So he's like a libertarian Muslim, and like he has written a book.
How does he get away from the hard offenses?
I think
because it's not just intercourse, it's also drinking wine. Is another hard offense.
And I think in his book, if I remember correctly, he says, look, he doesn't like give some kind of like, okay, this is there are these things in law, and uh, like he acknowledges that yes, in the traditionalist law there is this punishment,
Yes.
but he also says that okay, there's still some kind of liberal or libertarian spirit somewhat.
Uh-huh.
So we should perhaps like think of it in that terms,
Uh-huh.
and be libertarians instead of
Yeah.
using those punishments.
The
And
alternative, which would require much more knowledge than I have, would be to try to make an argument from the text of the Quran saying that the way that's been interpreted forever is wrong, because I'm not a Quranic scholar or anything close to it, but it's
yeah,
clear that there's a lot of ambiguity in the Quranic rules. That the wine drinking rule, for example, that's first the question is wine just wine, or is it an example of a family of things which would include beer and whiskey and so forth? And I gather that there is a positive reference to wine drinking early in the Quran and then a negative thing later on. So how do you, so I could imagine somebody with a bunch of knowledge I don't have trying to argue that that all of the sort of orthodox positions have been misreading the document. And I think I have seen that argument made not for those things, but for the prohibition on interest, on riba, that I don't remember where it was, but I remember I saw some scholar who was arguing that was a misinterpretation of the relevant rule. But the alternative is, you say that you don't believe in Islamic law, but then you're not you're not a believing Muslim in a very strong sense of the term.
yeah, that would be the thing. Now,
You might be somebody who says Islam has got wonderful traditions, and you could even have somebody who claims that the copies of the Quran we have are wrong, because as you may know, there is a point very early in Islamic history when they basically burn all variant copies and say this is the standard version. Well, suppose if you're absolutely convinced that something in the standard version is wrong, then you might plausibly say, all right, God gave orders. He inspired the prophet, and the prophet told everybody. But then the step that got from what God told the prophet to what got written down in our version of the Quran has some mistakes. And that's a possible position. I don't know if anybody's doing it, but I could certainly imagine an ambitious libertarian Muslim trying to make that argument.
yeah, I mean, personally, how would you like convince a person who is very traditionalist leaning towards these laws? Like
Yes.
you do not believe that
I wouldn't. That is, I think what I would try to do is to persuade a traditionalist Muslim that Islam supports a lot of libertarianism, not that it supports all of it. That is to say, because I don't see, I mean, if he really believes in the religion, he believes in the religion. On the other hand, the religion has a lot of stuff that can be interpreted in a libertarian fashion. That, as you may know, it's quite unclear whether the death sentence for abandoning Islam is real or not, because the argument the other way was that those, if not based on the Quran, it's based on hadith, on traditions of the prophet, I'm pretty sure. And my understanding is that those can be read as basically a punishment for treason, because in the prophet's time, the Muslims were fighting with the Meccan pagans and the Jews around them, and I don't know who else. So therefore, if you converting from Islam really means switching sides, and you get executed for that. And because we know that it is clear, I think, in the Quran that it says that there is no compulsion in religion. So I think you could have a serious traditional Muslim who simply chose to interpret all of the ambiguous things in a pro-libertarian position, and that would get you a pretty libertarian position. Even if another thing that there are a number of things that are actually quite attractive to the libertarian in the traditional Islamic system. For example, as you may know, the Quranic taxes are not in principle paid to the state. The Quranic taxes says God says you're supposed to take a certain amount of your wealth and spend it in the following way. And the different schools of law disagree on the details, but basically for things like helping travelers, helping students, helping people who are fighting for Islam and so forth. And you can, if you like, give that money to the ruler to distribute. You can distribute it yourself. You can find somebody who is in the business of distributing the Quranic tax and say, all right, you get to take 10% or something of it to pay you, and you go to the work of finding people and so forth. Well, that's, it's still a tax, but it's a much more attractive kind of tax than a tax that goes to the state and is controlled by the state. So it just seems to me that there are a lot of libertarian elements in traditional Islam, and somebody who's both a Muslim and a libertarian could point those out and talk about them and think about them. And presumably, if he's really a serious traditional believer in the traditional Islamic law, sorry about that, fornication's out.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. Though generally, when anarcho-capitalist, world is there. Now, some societies might be very restrictive, right? With their performance,
Yes.
what they are doing. Now, I'm thinking, okay, what are certain things that are allowable in anarcho-capitalist society that what are some things that are not allowable even in anarcho-capitalist society or something?
But I think it's very hard to answer that question, because anarcho-capitalism defines the mechanisms for making law. It doesn't define what the laws are. So that you're going to have a market equilibrium in the generation of law. And roughly speaking, though not precisely, you'll tend to generate economically efficient law. And what law is economically efficient partly depends on the objectives of the people in the society. So if you had a anarcho-capitalist society in which a large fraction of the population were believing Muslims, and they believed that it was wicked to fornicate or to have homosexual sex, the same way that you and I believe that murdering is wicked.
Yeah.
We don't consider the fact that a anarcho-capitalist legal system would punish you for committing murder to be a violation of liberty. Well, if you had a society where enough people had a different view than you and I do about what liberty was, it could still be anarcho-capitalist. There's no state. The law is being, you have private rights enforcement agencies and private arbitration agencies, that whole mechanism, but what it yields is going to depend on the market. So I don't think, I think one of the mistakes that people often make is to confuse libertarian and anarcho-capitalism. And that one of the attractions of anarcho-capitalism is that I think it is likely to generate a more libertarian legal system than any other mechanism I know of. But it is not guaranteed to give a more libertarian outcome than you can imagine.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. It seems to have a lot of libertarian elements, but it's not guaranteed it will be.
Yeah. Going back to the question of traditional Islam, I believe if you look literally at the traditional view on the way somebody gets to be caliph, it is supposed to be by unanimous assent. There's a wonderful story about Al-Mamun, who's one of my favorite caliphs, and he won a civil war with his brother. He's the one of the two sons of Harun al-Rashid, and at some point a Sufi asks him whether he is the usurper, whether he's legitimately the ruler of Islam, and he says, no, to be legitimately the ruler of Islam, I should have the assent of all of the Muslims. But unfortunately, there is nobody who has that. And if no one fills the role, then all sorts of terrible things will happen. The Byzantines will invade us, and the roads will be unsafe. So here's what I'm doing. I'm taking the role of the caliph. But if you find somebody who has unanimous assent of all the Muslims, of course I'll turn over the position to him immediately. It's a very safe offer. But that's one of my favorite sort of stories from Islamic history, which has lots of good stories. But in any case, but in principle, the theory was, I think, that you were supposed to have unanimous assent. And what happens in practice very early, I think at the beginning of the Umayyad dynasty, is they take the position that a small number of sort of leaders of the community get to speak for everybody. And then, if I remember correctly, Muawiyah, who's the first Umayyad, more or less coerces those people into approving his son as his heir. So I think if you look at the way things happen in the beginning, there really isn't a vote, and it's sort of a consensus process by which Ali, and then by which Abu Bakr, and then Ali, and then Uthman, and then Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. I got the order wrong. Become caliph. You don't at least see any clear. There doesn't seem to be there's no voting, and it looks as though it's sort of a consensus of the community kind of thing. And for a small community, that works pretty well. And if everybody agrees that so and so can do certain things, they can do it. But I don't think there really is a real serious theory in Islamic political science, and that is serious by means something you could really deduce from the Quran and the Hadith, as opposed to something some people believe in. So I don't think that believing in anarcho-capitalism is really inconsistent with being a Muslim. It's just that it would be an anarcho-capitalism which had a different set of laws being enforced by private courts than the ones you and I would support.
Should we support like a general sort of libertarianism, right? Like moral libertarianism, where we are
should we? Yes, that is to say, if I were in such a society, I would try to find a rights enforcement agency which did not agree to courts that held that fornication and homosexual intercourse were serious crimes. But I might fail. Might turn out that there weren't any such, and got to face the fact that people disagree about what rights people have, and you can't guarantee that you're going to get the ones that you think are right.
Yeah, that's true. Like that is there. Though I think generally people are trying to generally support libertarianism. Like there are people who have left their religions.
Yes.
They are supporting some sort of libertarianism.
But that's no problem. That is, say, if you're not a believing Muslim, then you don't have to believe in Islamic law. You can say, well, Islamic law has got a lot of good elements to it, but it was wrong on certain points.
Yeah. And I mean,
I should say one of the other things that I like about Islamic law is that it treats killing somebody basically as a tort, not as a crime. That is, it is treated as an offense against him and his kin, not as an offense against the state. So that basically the part of Islamic law that deals with killing and injury is a part which only happens when the victim takes an action, or if the victim is dead, his kin who have inherited his claim in effect take an action.
I mean, I think so. What was I thinking? So I think that on their side, they believe that, okay, look, we have to convert people or they are going to suffer forever in eternal hell, right?
But they also believe that conversion has to be voluntary.
Yeah, of course.
That is
true. That's true.
The Islamic policy is that conquering countries does not have to be voluntary. Putting countries under Islamic law does not have to be voluntary, but becoming a Muslim does. Now, according to who you believe, and I think there's disagreement, if you're not a Muslim, there are only a limited number of religions you're allowed to have. Basically, there are 3 tolerated religions. And some sources, I think, believe that's only true in Arabia. And of course, in practice, as I'm sure you know, the Mughals never made any serious effort to convert all of the Hindus into Muslims. And I don't know what their theoretical position was, but they didn't, in fact. But freedom of religion, it seems to me, is pretty much consistent with Islamic doctrine, and I think with Christian doctrine, as far as I know.
I think there are still, even with freedom of religion, you still cannot, within your community or religion, blaspheme. You still cannot blaspheme. You still cannot blaspheme. You still cannot commit blasphemy. So, for example, if you were under the state of Islamic law, and you
Yes.
were given freedom to be a Hindu or a Christian, you
Yes.
cannot blaspheme
Against the prophet.
against the prophet. You
Yes,
cannot
that's
perhaps. So criticism is still very, I think, generally limited.
yes.
Right.
I think that's right. But it is less free than a libertarian society would like, but
Yeah.
more free than many historical societies have been.
Yes, that's true. I think that so generally, their reasoning for conversion and for encouraging people to convert to Islam is that, okay, you are going to go to hell, so it is
Yes.
better for you for self-interest reasons to.
But I'm not really sure if that's true. That is to say, again, you'd have to be a better scholar of Islamic stuff than I am. But given the Islamic view of Christianity and Judaism, it's not clear that a Muslim would believe that a good Christian or a Jew couldn't go to heaven. That there is a quote, I think, in the Quran where God says, if I wanted everybody to be of one religion, I would have made them that way, with the implication that somehow it's acceptable. And of course, from the Islamic standpoint, I mean, Muhammad pretty clearly started out thinking he was a Jewish prophet. It was just the local Jews didn't agree. But so, and the Islam more or less incorporates most of Judaism and a good deal of Christianity, plus different interpretations and so forth. But I really don't know. You'd have to ask somebody who's more expert than I am what the doctrine is.
When I looked at like their major traditional websites, right, like islamqa.info, and some of the major scholars, like I think Asim al-Hakim, his name is, he's a Saudi Arabian, I think, scholar, perhaps. And so I think they would say that, like, first of all, I think atheism is still not, I think,
Right.
tolerated.
I think that's right. That is to say, not tolerated, meaning it was often, many things were tolerated in actual Islamic societies historically, including lots of homosexuality, for example. But in the legal theory, it's not. I think you're right that it's not tolerated. I'm not sure, but I think that's true.
So they want to, like, these days they want to enforce the legal theory too, not just just emulate some of the societies where satire or mockery or criticism of religion, criticism of their religion, and their religion was generally allowed or something like that. Like, I have read that there in the traditional societies, by traditional I mean back old times, there were a few atheists,
of course,
did criticize Islam within their society. I think they were, Persians or Arabs, and they were under the Islamic rule, but they were able to criticize. But currently, during current times, there are generally the traditionalists say that no, legal theory does not permit atheists.
But there are no Islamic states at this time that actually follow Islamic law. The Saudis are the closest, but I think even if you look at the Saudis, that, for example, my understanding is that if you kill somebody, you do end up having to pay diya to his kin, but you also get put in jail for some length of time. That's not in Islamic law. The only punishment in Islamic law, as I understand it, other than settling with his kin, is that you were supposed to fast for 2 months or free one believing slave. So you, in effect, owe a debt to God, and you owe a debt to the kin, but you owe nothing at all to the state. So I say the Saudis are closest. For a good many years, I taught a seminar on legal systems very different from ours, and Islamic law was one of them. And the last year I taught that before I retired, my class mostly consisted of Saudi LLM students. So I actually had primary sources in my classroom, and I could mine them on how the system worked. And that was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, it would be great to, talk to people with different, perspectives on stuff.
Yes.
So generally, I think we all wish, libertarians generally wish that people are, become more libertarian, I suppose,
Yes.
and more chill about stuff rather
Mm.
than, very, suppose, discouraging and
Yes.
perhaps making laws that
Yeah.
can really hurt people, So I think so. What I wanted to so how much time do you have left?
I should probably be going down to the kitchen in a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so.
Okay, 5 minutes, right? So I think perhaps maybe 5 minutes would be not enough, but I think this conversation was really great. It was fun to chat with you.
We can do it again sometime.
Yes, of course, we can do it again in the future, maybe a week later or something.
Mhm.
Have a great day, Dr.
Thank you
Friedman.
very much. It was fun for me too. Bye-bye.